The fluorescent lights above me have been humming the same tone for 43 days straight. I know because I've counted every single sunrise through the reinforced glass, watching the sky turn from black to gray to that sickly orange that never quite looks right anymore. My name is Derek Holloway, and I'm trapped in a quick stop on Route 9, surrounded by things that used to be people. It started on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were always slow at the store. Truckers usually rolled through on Mondays and Wednesdays, and the local traffic from Millbrook didn't pick up until Thursday when people got their paychecks. I was wiping down the coffee station around 11 p.m. when I heard the sirens. Not unusual for the highway, but these didn't fade into the distance, they multiplied. Dozens of them, overlapping into a wall of sound that made my teeth ache. The small television mounted behind the counter was playing some reality show I wasn't watching. Then it cut to an emergency broadcast. A woman with perfect makeup and terrified eyes read from a paper in her hands, and I caught fragments. Shelter in place, avoid contact, violent outbreaks across 3 counties. The signal died halfway through her sentence, replaced by static that sounded almost like screaming if you listened too closely. I grabbed my phone. No service. The cell towers must have been overwhelmed or damaged, or worse. That's when Marcus Chen stumbled through the front door. I knew Marcus. He drove the bread delivery truck, always showed up at 6 a.m. with jokes about his mother-in-law and samples of whatever new pastry the bakery was testing. But the Marcus who fell against my counter wasn't cracking jokes. Blood soaked through his uniform shirt from a wound on his shoulder that looked like someone had tried to eat through the fabric. His breathing came in wet gasps, and his eyes couldn't quite focus on my face. "Derek," he wheezed. "Lock the doors. Lock them now." I moved toward him, already reaching for the first aid kit under the register. "Marcus, what happened? Who did this to you?" He grabbed my wrist with strength that shocked me, yanking me close enough to smell the copper scent of his blood mixed with something else, something rotten and organic that made my stomach turn. "Not who. What? There's people out there, but they're not people anymore. They're sick. They're wrong. They'll kill you, Derek. They'll tear you apart, and they won't stop, and they won't die when you shoot them unless you—" His words dissolved into coughing that sprayed red across the lottery ticket display. I pulled back, instinct overriding compassion, and that's probably what saved my life. Marcus collapsed. I stood there like an idiot for maybe 5 seconds, paralyzed by the wrongness of watching a man I'd known for 2 years fold onto my floor like discarded clothing. Then his body started twitching. Not seizure twitching. This was different, purposeful. His fingers scraped against the linoleum in rhythm, like he was practicing piano scales. His head turned toward me, and I saw his pupils had blown out so wide his eyes looked black. I ran to the door and slammed the lock just as something hit the glass from outside. 3 people, or things that looked like people from a distance, pressed against the window with enough force to make the frame creak. Their hands left smears of dark fluid on the reinforced glass. One of them had half its face missing, jaw hanging at an angle that would have killed anything living. Another wore a Millbrook High School basketball jersey with the number 14 visible under layers of gore. The third was a woman in a business suit, her throat torn open so wide I could see the white of her spine through the wound. They didn't scream. They didn't make any sound that resembled human communication. Instead, they produced this low, constant groaning that resonated in my chest like feedback from a speaker. The sound didn't stop. It just continued monotone and hungry and utterly without emotion. Behind me, Marcus made the same noise. I spun around to find him on his feet, or what passed for feet when your muscles contract in ways that shouldn't be anatomically possible. He lurched toward me with his arms extended, fingers curled into claws, that shoulder wound weeping fluid that was too dark to be fresh blood. His mouth hung open, and I could see his tongue had turned gray. The shotgun was under the counter. I'd kept it there for 3 years, ever since the attempted robbery in 2019, when some tweaker had come in waving a knife and demanding everything in the register. I'd never fired it at a person before. never wanted to. I'd taken it to the Grange twice, shot at paper targets, and felt vaguely guilty about owning it even though everyone said a highway convenience store needed security. I dove for the counter, sliding across the surface like I was stealing home base. My fingers found the shotgun stock as Marcus crashed into the display of energy drinks behind me. Cans exploded everywhere, hissing and spraying liquid that mixed with his blood on the floor. I chambered around, the sound impossibly loud in the confined space, and pointed it at the thing that used to deliver my bread. Marcus, stop. I don't want to hurt you. He didn't stop, didn't even slow down. He came at me with that terrible groaning sound vibrating in his ruined throat, and I saw absolutely nothing of my friend left in those black eyes. I pulled the trigger. The blast caught him center mass and threw him backward into the refrigerated section. The glass doors shattered, and Marcus went down in a pile of broken beverage bottles and glittering fragments. I stood there shaking, ears ringing, watching for movement. He twitched once, twice. Then his head lifted, and I realized the body shot hadn't stopped him at all. The things outside intensified their assault on the window. More had arrived. I could see at least a dozen now, maybe more in the darkness beyond the parking lot lights. They clawed at the glass with relentless, mechanical determination, leaving trails of filth that obscured my view of the highway. Marcus struggled to his feet, dragging his legs through the mess of glass and liquid. I chambered another round and aimed higher. This time I didn't hesitate. This time I didn't say his name. The second shot took off most of his head, and he finally stopped moving. I vomited into the trash can behind the counter, bile burning my throat, hands still gripping the shotgun so hard my knuckles had turned white. That was 6 months ago. If you've ever wondered what you'd do when your normal Tuesday becomes your worst nightmare, you'll understand what happens next. Hit that like button and subscribe. This is only the beginning of my isolation. The store is exactly 1,214 square feet. I measured it during week 2, when I needed something to do besides stare at the creatures pressing against every window. The main floor contains 12 aisles of merchandise, though merchandise feels like the wrong word for what's become my survival inventory. The back room holds the walk-in cooler, a tiny bathroom with a sink that still produces water from some miracle of municipal plumbing, and the storage area where I've built something resembling a sleeping space, from cardboard boxes and emergency blankets. The reinforced glass is the only reason I'm still breathing. When the previous owner built this place in 2008, he'd been paranoid about robberies. The windows and doors are commercial-grade security glass, the kind designed to withstand repeated impacts from blunt objects. The frames are steel, bolted into concrete foundations. The building itself is cinder block construction with a flat roof and only 3 points of entry: front door, back door, and a small delivery access on the eastern wall. All 3 are locked and barricaded. The creatures learned quickly that they couldn't break through. That doesn't stop them from trying. I've counted 43 distinct individuals in the immediate vicinity, though the number fluctuates. Some wander off after days or weeks of futile clawing. Others arrive to replace them, drawn by sound or movement or some instinct I don't understand. They press against the glass day and night, leaving smears of decay that I can't clean from the inside. The smell doesn't penetrate. Thank God for sealed construction. But I can imagine it based on what Marcus smelled like in his final moments. The inventory became my obsession. I started cataloging everything on day 3, after I'd finished reinforcing the doors with shelving units and accepted that I wasn't leaving anytime soon. I found a composition notebook in the school supplies section and began documenting every item in the store with the meticulous attention of an accountant preparing for an audit. The quick stop had been fully stocked when the outbreak hit. Tuesday was delivery day. Marcus had been coming to drop off bread when he got infected. That meant I had fresh supplies of almost everything. 347 cans and packages of various foods. 2 gallons of water in bottles and jugs, cleaning supplies, medical basics, batteries, lighters, and enough cigarettes to trade for a small fortune if there was still a world where currency mattered. I don't smoke, but I calculated that those cigarettes represent approximately 72,000 calories if I get desperate enough to eat tobacco. I hope it doesn't come to that. The coolers lost power after 10 days. I heard the generators fail in the middle of the night. A grinding sound followed by silence that was somehow louder than the noise had been. Everything in the refrigerated sections began to spoil. I salvaged what I could, eating dairy products and fresh foods first, but most of it turned into a rotting mess that attracted flies and made the whole store smell like death for weeks. I sealed off the cooler section with plastic sheeting and duct tape, creating a containment area for the biological hazard. The smell eventually faded, or maybe I just got used to it. Hard to say which. Water was my primary concern. The tap in the back bathroom still flowed, which meant the municipal water system was somehow maintaining pressure despite everything. I didn't trust it to last forever, so I began filling every container I could find. Empty soda bottles, the mop bucket, pots from the limited kitchenware section, and the large plastic bins that had held beef jerky on display. I created a water storage area in the back room, organized by date of collection, so I'd use the oldest first. I rationed myself to half a gallon per day for all purposes: drinking, cooking, washing. That meant I smelled constantly and my skin itched from accumulated grime, but it meant I could theoretically survive for months even if the tap dried up tomorrow. Food rationing proved more complicated. I calculated my daily caloric needs at approximately 2,000 calories to maintain my body weight and functionality. The inventory could support that for maybe 8 months if I was careful, longer if I was willing to lose mass. I created a meal schedule based on nutritional balance and variety to prevent psychological breakdown from eating the same thing repeatedly. Breakfast: one package of instant oatmeal prepared with shelf-stable milk powder and water, or a protein bar if I wanted to save fuel for cooking. Lunch: canned soup or chili, one serving of crackers. Dinner: canned vegetables, canned meat if I was feeling extravagant, rice or pasta prepared on the camping stove. The camping stove had been a display model near the seasonal section. It came with 2 propane canisters. I found 8 more in storage. Each canister lasted about 14 days with conservative use. That gave me approximately 140 days of cooking fuel, which meant I'd need to start eating cold food sometime around month 5. I tried not to think about month 5. The days developed a rhythm out of necessity. I woke when light filtered through the grime on the windows, usually around 7 a.m. First task: check all entry points for signs of breach. The creatures didn't seem capable of complex problem-solving, but I'd seen them pile up against the doors in ways that suggested some level of coordination. I examined every seal, every barricade, every potential weak point. Second task: bathroom routine. I gave myself exactly 4 cups of water for washing, 1 for face, 1 for upper body, 1 for lower body, 1 for brushing teeth. The rest of my hygiene routine had devolved to basic maintenance. Shaving stopped after the first week. Showering was a distant memory. Third task: breakfast and inventory check. I ate my measured portion and then spent an hour documenting any consumption in my notebook, updating my projections for how long the supplies would last. I became fanatical about accuracy. If I ate 3 crackers instead of the planned 2, I noted it. If I spilled half a can of beans, I recorded the loss. The precision kept me sane. Fourth task: physical maintenance. I couldn't let my body deteriorate, so I created an exercise routine using the limited space. Push-ups against the counter, squats in the main aisle, walking circuits around the perimeter, stepping over the dried bloodstain where Marcus had fallen. I maintained this routine religiously, counting reps, pushing myself until my muscles burned and my mind stopped wandering to dark places. Fifth task: fortification improvements. I continuously reinforced my defenses, creating redundant barriers, improving the barricades, organizing supplies for maximum efficiency. I moved the most critical items, water, canned food, medical supplies, to the back room where they'd be accessible even if something breached the main floor. Sixth task, observation and documentation. I spent hours watching the creatures through the filthy glass, studying their behavior, trying to understand the rules that governed their existence. I documented everything in my notebook: movement patterns, response to stimuli, signs of decay or change over time. They never slept, never rested. The groaning continued 24 hours a day, fading to background noise that I only noticed when it stopped briefly, usually when they all turned in unison towards some distant sound only they could perceive. Seventh task, dinner and evening inventory. Eighth task, entertainment and mental health. This was the hardest part. The store had a limited magazine selection, mostly automotive and sports publications that I'd read cover to cover multiple times. I rationed these like food, allowing myself to read one article per evening to preserve some sense of novelty. I also talked to myself, maintaining running commentary on my actions to prevent the silence from becoming absolute. Derek's making dinner tonight, folks. We've got a lovely can of mixed vegetables, vintage 2025, paired with a tin of processed chicken that may or may not be actual chicken. The fluorescent lighting gives everything an appetizing green tint. 5 stars would trap myself here again. The humor felt forced, but it was better than the alternative. Ninth task, sleep preparation. I secured myself in the back room, barricading the door from inside in case something got through the outer defenses while I was unconscious. I slept in my clothes, with the shotgun next to me, and a knife from the limited cutlery section under my makeshift pillow. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of the glass breaking and the groaning getting louder, and hands reaching through the darkness to find my throat. This routine continued for weeks. The isolation did strange things to my perception of time. Days blurred together into an undifferentiated mass of fluorescent lighting and routine tasks. I lost track of the date multiple times and had to recalculate based on my inventory consumption records. The notebook became my external memory, the only proof that time was actually passing and I wasn't stuck in some eternal loop of checking barricades and eating canned soup. I started naming the creatures. It was a bad idea. I knew that even as I did it. But the alternative was thinking of them as an anonymous horde, which somehow felt worse. I gave them names based on distinguishing characteristics or what they'd been wearing when they died. Jersey was the basketball player, number 14, whose face had mostly rotted away by week 3. Suit was the businesswoman, still wearing her blazer despite the massive throat wound. Trucker had the build and the flannel shirt, though his hat had fallen off at some point. Teenager wore what remained of a Millbrook High School Letterman jacket. Grocery had a name tag from the supermarket in town still pinned to his shredded uniform. I watched them deteriorate over time. The decay accelerated in some, creating exposed bone and missing chunks of flesh. Others seemed to mummify, their skin tightening and darkening until they looked like leather stretched over skeletons. The smell must have been incredible, but my sealed environment spared me from experiencing it directly. They never attacked each other. That was one of the first patterns I identified. Despite being pressed together in a crowd, despite the apparent hunger that drove them to claw at my windows, they never turned on their own kind. They existed in this weird cooperative state, unified by their singular focus on reaching me. I wondered sometimes if they knew I was human, or if I just represented movement and warmth, and something their destroyed brains identified as food. I wondered if anything of the person remained inside, trapped and screaming behind eyes that had gone black. I wondered if Marcus had felt anything in those final seconds before I shot him, or if the infection had already eaten away everything that made him Marcus Chen, delivery driver, joke teller, someone who'd brought me pastries and complained about his mother-in-law. I tried not to wonder too much. Wondering led to thinking, and thinking led to places that made the shotgun seem like a solution instead of a tool. The first major crisis came on day 37. I was conducting my morning barricade check when I noticed movement on the roof. Something was up there, scraping and thumping against the flat surface above my head. The creatures below had never shown any ability to climb, but maybe this one had found a ladder, or fallen from a second-story building, or retained enough cognitive function to problem solve. My heart rate spiked as I grabbed the shotgun and tried to pinpoint the location of the sound. The store had a drop ceiling, acoustic tiles in a metal grid suspended below the actual roof structure. If something broke through the roof itself, there'd be a gap before it reached the drop ceiling. But that gap wouldn't stop a determined creature for long. The scraping intensified, focusing on an area above the storage room. I heard gravel and debris falling, clattering against the roofing material. Then a crack, sharp and definitive, that made me grip the shotgun until my hands ached. I positioned myself in the back room, aiming upward, waiting for the ceiling to collapse and something to come tumbling through. The scraping continued for another 20 minutes, then stopped. Silence except for the constant groaning from the creatures surrounding the building. I waited. 10 minutes, 20, an hour. Nothing fell through the ceiling. Eventually, I lowered the shotgun and checked the barricades again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The roof had held. The structure was solid cinder block and steel, designed to withstand weather and weight, but the fact that something had tried meant they were adapting, learning, testing different approaches to reach me. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing the backroom ceiling with shelving units propped at angles to catch anything that might fall through. I moved my sleeping area to a different corner, away from the section where I'd heard the scraping. I barely slept that night, jerking awake at every small sound, convinced that the ceiling was about to give way and drop a writhing mass of infected flesh onto my face. The roof held, but the psychological damage was done. I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that I'd been assuming the creatures were limited to ground-level assault. What if they could climb? What if they could coordinate? What if enough of them piled up on one side to create a ramp that others could use to reach the roof? I began a new project, mapping every possible entry point and creating contingency plans for each scenario. Front door breach, fall back to the back room, use it as a secondary defensive position. Backdoor breach, abandon the back room, barricade myself in the walk-in cooler despite the smell. Window failure, depending on location, either retreat or try to reseal the breach with plastic sheeting and duct tape. Roof breach. That was the nightmare scenario. If they came through the ceiling, I had nowhere to retreat. The back room became a trap rather than a sanctuary. I'd have to make a stand in the main store area and hope the shotgun had enough shells to stop whatever came through. I counted my ammunition obsessively. 43 shells total. Enough for every creature I'd identified, but only if I didn't miss, didn't waste shots, and didn't encounter more than 43 of them. The math wasn't comforting. Week 6 brought a new development: silence. I woke one morning to the absence of sound and thought for a moment that I'd gone deaf. The groaning had become such a constant presence that its absence felt like physical pressure against my eardrums. I rushed to the window and looked out through the grime to find nothing. The parking lot was empty. All 43 of my regular visitors had vanished overnight, leaving only their smears of biological residue on the glass and ground. The highway beyond stretched silent and still in the gray morning light. No movement, no sound. Nothing but the wind pushing scraps of debris across the asphalt. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt terror. Where had they gone? Why had they left? What was out there that was more interesting than the human trapped in the convenience store? I spent the entire day watching the windows, expecting them to return, but the parking lot remained empty. The silence felt wrong, like that moment of pressure dropped before a tornado touches down. Something had changed in the world beyond my reinforced glass prison. and I had no way of knowing what. On day 44, they came back. Not all of them, maybe 20. They returned to their positions against the windows as if they'd never left, resuming the constant groaning and clawing that had become the soundtrack to my existence. But the others, Jersey, Suit, Trucker, and about 20 more, never reappeared. I didn't know if they'd decayed beyond functionality, gotten distracted by other prey, or been destroyed by something I couldn't see. The not knowing was worse than any scenario I could imagine. The isolation was taking its toll in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself having conversations with the creatures, addressing them by their names, narrating my actions as if they cared. Morning grocery. See, I'm having oatmeal again. I know. I'm in a rut. Maybe tomorrow I'll go crazy and have a protein bar. Live a little. I knew it was unhealthy. I knew I was anthropomorphizing things that wanted to eat me. But the alternative was absolute silence, and absolute silence led to thoughts I couldn't afford to entertain. I started talking to Marcus, too. I'd cleaned up his body on day 5, wrapping it in plastic sheeting and dragging it to the walk-in cooler where the cold would slow decomposition. I'd told myself it was about sanitation and preventing disease, but really, it was because I couldn't stand looking at the bloodstain and remembering what I'd done. But now I found myself standing at the cooler door, talking through the plastic sheeting. Inventory's holding up, Marcus. Your bread lasted 2 weeks before it went moldy. I saved some for the ducks in the pond behind the store, but then I remembered the ducks are probably all infected or dead. Stupid, right? Thinking about feeding ducks during the apocalypse. Marcus didn't respond, which was probably for the best. The notebook entries became increasingly detailed and occasionally incoherent. Day 51, 8 half-can of peaches for dinner. Sweet, reminded me of summer. Uncle Frank's farm. Peach trees in the back 40. Haven't thought about Uncle Frank in years. Is he still alive? Is anyone still alive? Saw a bird today, first bird in weeks. Landed on the roof, normal bird, not infected. Felt like seeing an alien. How do birds survive this? Do they eat infected things? Can infection pass to birds? Need to stop thinking about birds. Day 52. Jersey's left arm fell off today. Just dropped off while he was clawing at the window. He didn't notice. Kept using his right arm. The left arm is still lying in the parking lot. Strange to see a body part separated from the body, but both parts still trying to reach me. Philosophically interesting. Physically disturbing. Day 53. Ran out of coffee 3 days ago, but just admitted it today. Can't start the day without coffee. Except I am starting the day without coffee. So that's a lie I've been telling myself. How many other lies? Getting dangerous in here. Getting dangerous in my head. The psychological deterioration accelerated after week 8. I started seeing patterns that probably weren't there. The creatures seemed to coordinate their movements in ways that suggested intelligence. 3 would press on the left window while 2 tested the door, as if they were probing for weaknesses systematically. Then I'd blink and realize they were just shuffling randomly, that I was imposing order on chaos because my brain needed there to be rules. I began losing time. I'd start a task, reorganizing the canned goods by expiration date, and suddenly it would be 3 hours later and I'd have no memory of the interval. The notebook helped anchor me to reality, but even that became unreliable when I found entries I didn't remember writing. Day 61. The fluorescent lights are spelling messages in Morse code. Dash, 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 SOS? Or just broken ballasts? Can't remember Morse code. Learned it in Boy Scouts, but that was Tyler who learned it, not me. I was never in Boy Scouts. Why did I think I was Tyler? I didn't know anyone named Tyler. The inventory checks became rituals rather than practical assessments. I'd count the same stack of soup cans 5 times, convinced the number changed between counts. 47 cans, then 43, then 52. Finally, I'd write down an average and move on. knowing the data was corrupted but unable to trust my own perception enough to determine the truth. Food started tasting like cardboard. Not metaphorically, everything literally had the same texture and flavor profile as wet cardboard, regardless of what the label claimed it should be. Chicken soup, vegetable medley, fruit cocktail, all of it dissolved into the same bland paste in my mouth. I ate because the schedule demanded it, not because I felt hunger. My body was consuming itself slowly, burning muscle mass to sustain basic functions on inadequate calories. I'd lost weight. I could feel it in how my pants hung loose on my hips, how my ribs had become visible when I washed in the bathroom. The mirror above the sink showed a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt, with skin that had taken on a gray pallor from months without sunlight. I looked more like the creatures outside than I wanted to admit. Week 10 brought the fever. I woke shivering despite the store's stale warmth, my body alternating between chills and sweats that soaked through my clothes. My head felt stuffed with cotton, and my throat burned when I swallowed. For one terrible moment, I thought I'd somehow been infected, that Marcus's blood had gotten into a cut I hadn't noticed, that I was going to turn into one of those things and spend eternity groaning mindlessly at my own abandoned store. But the fever broke after 2 days, leaving me weak but still human. Probably just a regular illness, my immune system compromised by stress and poor nutrition, fighting off some mundane bacterial infection. I dosed myself with expired cold medicine from the pharmacy section and drank extra water and waited for my body to recover. During the fever, I had dreams that felt more real than waking. I dreamed I was outside, walking down Route 9 toward Millbrook, passing cars abandoned in the middle of the road with their doors hanging open. The sky was that wrong orange color, and the air smelled like smoke and spoiled meat. I passed creatures standing motionless beside the road, watching me with their black eyes but not attacking. In the dream, I understood that I was already one of them, that I'd died weeks ago and just hadn't noticed, that the store was my purgatory and I'd be checking inventory for eternity. I woke screaming into my hand, muffling the sound so the creatures outside wouldn't hear and intensify their assault. The fever left me weaker than before. My exercise routine suffered. I couldn't complete half my usual push-ups before my arms gave out. Walking the perimeter made me dizzy. I reduced my calorie intake further to compensate for the decreased activity, which created a vicious cycle of weakness feeding into more weakness. The notebook entry for day 73 was a single sentence: getting harder to care about staying alive. I stared at those words for an hour after writing them, trying to decide if they were true or just fever brain residue. The shotgun was right there, loaded, easy. One shot, and the fluorescent lights would stop humming. The groaning would stop mattering. I wouldn't have to count another can of soup, or measure another cup of water, or wake up to another identical day in my glass prison. But I didn't pick up the shotgun. Instead, I started a new project, mapping the world beyond my windows. I used the back of register receipt paper to sketch everything I could see from each vantage point. The parking lot with its 6 vehicles, 2 sedans, 3 trucks, 1 SUV, all abandoned in various states of decay. The highway stretching northeast toward Millbrook and southwest toward the interstate junction. The woods on the far side of the road, dense with pine and oak. The cell tower visible on the horizon to the west. I documented changes over time. One of the sedans had a flat tire on day 40. By day 60, all 4 tires were flat. The SUV's windshield developed a crack that grew longer each week. Vegetation started reclaiming the asphalt, weeds pushing through cracks in the parking lot, vines creeping up the abandoned vehicles. Nature was adapting faster than I was. Asterisk CTA number 2. I know you're wondering if I ever tried to escape. The next part will show you exactly why staying put was the only option, and why that option was slowly killing me anyway. Don't go anywhere. Month 4 marked the beginning of the end for my supplies. The careful rationing had extended my timeline, but mathematics don't lie. I'd consumed roughly 60% of the viable food inventory. The remaining cans and packages represented maybe 8 more weeks at current consumption rates, less if I wanted to maintain enough strength to function. I created a new spreadsheet in my notebook, calculating different scenarios. Scenario A: maintain current calorie intake, survive until approximately day 190, then starve. Scenario B: reduce intake by 25%, extend survival to day 210, but risk becoming too weak to defend myself if something breached the barricades. Scenario C: reduce intake by 50%, extend survival to day 240, except that I'd be barely functional, essentially waiting to die in slow motion. Scenario D: stop rationing, eat freely for comfort, survive until day 160, but go out on a full stomach. None of the scenarios ended with rescue. None of them ended with escape. They all ended with me dead in the quick stop on Route 9, another casualty of whatever plague had turned the world into a graveyard. I chose scenario B, not out of hope, exactly, but out of stubborn refusal to simply give up. If I was going to die here, I'd die having fought for every extra day, having squeezed every possible hour out of my situation. Maybe that was foolish. Maybe scenario D was more humane, but I couldn't bring myself to accept that this was truly the end. The reduced calories made everything harder. My morning routine took twice as long because I had to rest between tasks. The exercise regimen became a joke. 10 push-ups left me gasping, and walking the perimeter required breaks every other aisle. My mind felt slower too, thoughts moving through thick fog, connections taking longer to form. I started making mistakes. I knocked over a display of canned tomatoes and didn't have the energy to pick them all up immediately, leaving them scattered across the floor for 3 days. I forgot to check one of the barricades during my morning inspection, and only remembered at night, forcing myself out of my sleeping area to verify it was still secure. I left the camping stove burning for an hour after cooking, wasting precious propane because I'd wandered away and forgotten I'd been making dinner. The creatures noticed my deterioration somehow. They increased their assault on the windows, pressing harder, clawing with more intensity. Maybe they could smell weakness. Maybe the infection gave them some sensory ability I didn't understand. Or maybe it was coincidence, random fluctuation in behavior that I was interpreting through my paranoia. Either way, the pressure intensified. I heard the glass creaking under their weight during day 112, a sound like ice about to crack, high-pitched and ominous. I stood with the shotgun aimed at the front window, watching the reinforced glass flex inward by millimeters, convinced this was the moment it would fail, and I'd have to make my last stand. The glass held, but it had bent. It had moved. The supposedly indestructible barrier between me and death had shown vulnerability, and now I couldn't stop watching it, waiting for the next creak, the next flexion, the inevitable failure. I reinforced the window from inside using shelving units wedged at angles against the frame. It was inadequate. If the glass actually shattered, a few metal shelves wouldn't stop the tide, but doing something felt better than waiting passively for catastrophe. Day 120 brought a new visitor, a child. I saw him appear at the edge of the parking lot around noon, stumbling out of the woods with his arms hanging limp at his sides. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, wearing a striped shirt that was too big for his frame, and sneakers with cartoon characters on the sides. Half his face had been torn away, revealing teeth and bone, but the remaining eyes still had that black, empty quality I'd come to recognize. I named him Kid because I couldn't handle giving him a real name, couldn't handle thinking about what his parents had called him before he died and came back wrong. Kid joined the others at the window, pressing his small hands against the glass at chest height, leaving prints that were so much smaller than the adult smears surrounding them. He groaned the same monotone note as the rest, but higher pitched, almost musical. I stopped watching the windows after that. Seeing Kid destroyed something in me that had remained intact through everything else. I could rationalize adults. Marcus had been an adult, capable of understanding risk, theoretically prepared to face death in an apocalypse. But Kid had just been a child, probably scared, definitely not comprehending what was happening to him. He'd been someone's son. Some parent out there had watched him die, or had died themselves, without knowing what happened to their boy. I spent 3 days sitting in the back room with my eyes closed, eating mechanically, performing only the minimum tasks necessary for survival. The notebook sat untouched. The exercise routine abandoned. I just existed, breathing in and out, waiting for time to pass or end or something to change. On day 124, I made a decision. I was going to leave. The store had protected me for 4 months, but it was also killing me. Slowly, psychologically, grinding away my humanity day by day until I'd be just as dead as the creatures outside, just better at pretending. I'd die here eventually, when the food ran out, too weak to defend myself, too broken to care. Or I could take my chances in the world beyond the glass, maybe find other survivors, maybe discover that somewhere out there people were rebuilding. Probably I'd die in the parking lot 30 seconds after opening the door. But at least I'd die having tried. I spent the next week preparing. I gathered supplies, backpack filled with canned food, water bottles, can opener, knife, lighter, first aid kit, extra ammunition. I selected weapons, shotgun as primary, crowbar from the tool section as backup, knife strapped to my belt. I studied the parking lot layout, identifying a route to the nearest vehicle, the pickup truck closest to the front door, maybe 20 feet away. If I could reach the truck and if it had keys and if the engine still turned over after months of sitting idle, I might be able to escape before the creatures surrounded me. 3 ifs stacked on top of each other, each one unlikely, but together representing maybe a 5% chance of survival. 5% was better than 0. I wrote a final notebook entry on day 130. To whoever finds this, my name is Derek Holloway. I survived in the Millbrook Quick Stop on Route 9 for 130 days after the outbreak. I rationed carefully. I documented everything. I stayed human as long as I could. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead in the parking lot or on the road somewhere. Don't make my mistakes. Don't trap yourself. Keep moving. Stay human. Good luck. I barricaded the notebook in the back room where it wouldn't be immediately destroyed if creatures breached the store after I left. Maybe someone would find it. Maybe it would matter. Probably not. On day 131 at dawn, I positioned myself at the front door. The creatures were at their lowest activity in early morning. I documented this pattern over months of observation. They didn't sleep, but they slowed down, their movements becoming more lethargic, their groaning quieter. It was as close to an advantage as I'd get. I counted 15 creatures visible in the parking lot. Kid was there, standing near the propane tank cage. Grocery was pressed against the window to my left. Others I hadn't named clustered around the door, waiting for me to emerge like they'd been waiting for 4 months. I checked my supplies one last time. Backpack secure, shotgun loaded, crowbar in hand for immediate use, since the shotgun would require 2 hands and I'd need 1 free to open the door. Knife accessible on my belt. My hands shook as I reached for the lock. 4 months of safety, 4 months of isolation, 4 months of slowly dying in fluorescent lighting. I was giving it all up for a probably suicidal dash to a truck that might not even start. I unlocked the deadbolt. The sound seemed impossibly loud. The creatures reacted immediately, their groaning intensifying, bodies pressing harder against the glass. They knew something was changing. They'd been waiting for this moment. I gripped the door handle. Asterisk CTA number 3. What happened when I opened that door changed everything I thought I knew about survival. If you've stuck with me this far, you need to see how this ends. Hit that subscribe button. You won't believe what comes next. The door swung outward, and I moved. The morning air hit my face like a physical force. Cold, filled with the smell of decay I'd been spared for months, carrying sounds that weren't filtered through reinforced glass. The groaning surrounded me in stereo, coming from every direction, no longer muffled but raw and immediate and hungry. I ran. 3 steps to clear the doorway, 5 more to the truck. The creatures converged from the sides, faster than they'd seemed through the window, their movements surprisingly quick despite the decay. Grocery reached for me from the left, fingers scraping across my jacket. I swung the crowbar instinctively, connecting with his skull with a crack that reverberated up my arm. He went down. 10 steps. The truck was right there, door handle visible, driver's side window intact. Kid appeared in front of me, stumbling directly into my path. I didn't think. I kicked him aside, his small body offering almost no resistance, and immediately felt sick but couldn't stop moving. The creatures were closing in, hands grasping, mouths open, that groaning building to a crescendo that made my teeth ache. 15 steps. I reached the truck. The door was locked. Of course it was locked. Why would it be unlocked? Why would I get even one break in this nightmare scenario? I smashed the window with the crowbar, glass exploding inward, and reached through to unlock it from inside. Something grabbed my backpack. I spun, shotgun coming up, and fired point blank into the creature's face. It dropped, and I yanked open the door. No keys. The ignition was empty. The keys were gone, probably in the pocket of whoever had owned this truck, probably on a corpse somewhere in Millbrook, or inside one of the other abandoned vehicles, or lying in the woods where someone had dropped them while running for their life. More creatures were coming. I could see them emerging from the far side of the parking lot, from the woods, from the highway. Dozens of them, drawn by the shotgun blast and the commotion and the presence of living flesh after months of stagnant hunting. I made a calculation in half a second. The truck was defensible. Higher ground, enclosed space, solid metal construction. I could barricade myself in the cab, use it as a temporary fortress while I figured out what to do next. It was that, or try to run down the highway with a pack of creatures chasing me, and I wasn't in condition for a prolonged chase. I climbed into the truck and slammed the door. Immediately, creatures surrounded the vehicle, pressing against the windows, rocking it with their collective weight. The driver's side window was broken. I'd smashed it myself, which meant they could reach through, but the opening was small enough that I could defend it with the crowbar. I sat in the driver's seat, breathing hard, adrenaline making my hands shake, and realized I'd just traded one prison for a smaller, less secure one. The truck had maybe a quarter tank of gas, according to the gauge. It had no keys. It had broken windows on the driver's side and a crack spreading across the windshield from where a creature had just headbutted it. It offered 0 long-term survival advantages and several significant disadvantages compared to the store. I'd made a terrible mistake. For an hour, I fought them off through the broken window. They reached through 1 or 2 at a time, and I smashed their arms with the crowbar, broke their fingers, crushed their wrists until they withdrew. But they didn't stop. They didn't feel pain. They didn't learn to avoid the crowbar. They just kept reaching, relentless and patient and utterly without fear. My arms started to tire. Each swing of the crowbar took more effort. The creatures weren't getting tired. They'd keep this up forever, taking turns reaching through the window, wearing me down until I couldn't lift the crowbar anymore, and they'd pull me through the opening piece by piece. I looked back at the store. The front door was still open, swinging slightly in the wind. The interior was dark beyond the entrance, my 4-month sanctuary abandoned. Some creatures had already moved inside. I could see shadows moving through the aisles, knocking over displays, contaminating my carefully rationed supplies with their decay. But not all of them had gone inside. Most remained focused on the truck, on me, on the fresh prey that had finally emerged from hiding. I counted approximately 40 creatures surrounding the vehicle, More were visible in the distance, shambling across the parking lot to join the feast. At least 60 total, maybe more. Far more than I'd ever seen concentrated in one area. My ammunition wouldn't last. 43 shells against 60-plus targets, and I'd already used one on grocery. I'd run out of bullets before I ran out of creatures, and then I'd be trapped in a metal box waiting to die of thirst while they clawed their way inside. The sun climbed higher. The day grew warmer. Inside the truck cab, the temperature rose until sweat soaked my clothes and breathing became labored in the confined space. I couldn't open the windows for ventilation because that would give the creatures more access points. I couldn't run the air conditioning because I had no keys. I was cooking inside a metal box, surrounded by things that wanted to eat me, having voluntarily abandoned the one place that had kept me safe. Hour 3 brought clarity through desperation. I needed to get back inside the store. 20 feet. That's all I had to cover. 20 feet of parking lot swarming with creatures. With me carrying a heavy backpack and wielding weapons I was already too exhausted to use effectively. But the store had water. The store had food. The store had reinforced walls that wouldn't cook me like an oven. If I stayed in the truck, I'd die of heat exhaustion within hours. If I tried to run down the highway, I'd be pulled down within seconds. The store was my only option, which meant I'd just risked everything to learn that my original strategy was correct. The irony wasn't lost on me. I planned the route: exit through the passenger door away from the main concentration of creatures, sprint along the far side of the truck to use it as a barrier, then make a straight dash to the store entrance. Shotgun in hand this time, crowbar abandoned, because I needed both hands free to grab the door and slam it shut behind me. I counted down from 10 to 0, forcing myself to move when my brain screamed at me to stay hidden. 9, 8, 7. The creatures pressed against all the windows, black eyes staring without comprehension. 6, 5, 4. I shifted to the passenger seat, hand on the door handle. 3, 2, 1. I burst out of the truck and ran. The creatures on the passenger side were fewer, maybe 6 or 7, and my sudden appearance confused them for a critical half-second. I was past them before they could grab me, using the truck as a shield, feet pounding against asphalt that felt strange and open after months of walking on linoleum. 10 feet. Something grabbed my backpack again. I twisted, letting the straps slide off my shoulders, sacrificing my supplies to maintain momentum. The backpack fell into grasping hands, and the creatures fought over it like animals, buying me another precious second. 15 feet. The store entrance loomed ahead, dark and inviting and full of creatures that had wandered inside. I couldn't see how many. Didn't matter. I charged through the door anyway because there was nowhere else to go. 3 creatures inside the front area. I shot the first one without aiming, just pointing and pulling the trigger. It dropped. The second one came at me from the left, and I used the shotgun like a club, smashing it across the face hard enough to shatter its jaw. It stumbled but didn't fall. The third one was Kid. He stood in the candy aisle, small hands reaching toward me, that remaining eye fixed on my face, groaning his high-pitched note. Behind him, through the broken displays and scattered merchandise, I could see more creatures moving through the store, contaminating everything I'd worked so hard to preserve. I raised the shotgun. Kid stumbled closer. My finger tightened on the trigger. I couldn't do it. Instead, I shoved past him, racing toward the back room. Creatures emerged from the aisles, grabbing at me, but I was moving with panic strength, fueled by adrenaline and desperation and the absolute certainty that I had maybe 3 seconds to secure myself before I was overwhelmed. I hit the back room door, slammed it behind me, threw the bolt lock and collapsed against it as bodies thudded into the other side. I was back where I started. Except now the main store was compromised. Creatures wandered freely through the aisles, destroying my inventory, contaminating my supplies. My backpack was lost in the parking lot. I was down to the shotgun with 41 shells remaining. the knife on my belt, and whatever supplies I'd already stored in the back room. I'd gained nothing and lost almost everything. I sat with my back against the door, feeling the impacts as creatures threw themselves against it from the other side, and I laughed, broken, hysterical laughter that hurt my chest and brought tears I couldn't stop. I'd survived 4 months through careful planning and rationing and isolation, and then I'd destroyed it all in one morning of stupidity. Asterisk CTA number 4. You need to see how this ends. After everything, the isolation, the escape attempt, the return, there's one final twist that changed my understanding of survival itself. Make sure you're subscribed and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. The conclusion will haunt you. Yes, the back room became my final fortress. I assessed my remaining resources, 14 cans of various foods that I'd stored back here as emergency backup, 6 gallons of water, the shotgun with 41 shells, the knife, a lighter, some plastic sheeting, duct tape, and the camping stove with maybe 3 days of propane remaining. 14 cans represented approximately 2 weeks of survival at starvation rations, maybe 3 weeks if I pushed it to the absolute limit. Then I'd die in this small room while creatures pressed against the door, having postponed the inevitable by an absurdly short period. The door was solid, but not designed to withstand prolonged assault. It was a standard commercial interior door, hollow core, basic lock, hinges on the inside where I could reinforce them. The creatures didn't have the intelligence to target structural weak points, but they had time and persistence, and eventually something would give. I reinforced the hinges with shelving bracket screws from the supply closet. I wedged the metal storage shelves against the door at angles to distribute the impact force. I created a secondary barrier using the plastic sheeting and the remaining merchandise boxes, building a wall within the room that would slow anything that breached the primary door. Then I sat down and tried to think. The ceiling access. The store had a drop ceiling in the main area, but the back room had direct access to the roof structure, a maintenance hatch in the corner that I'd noticed during my first days, but dismissed because I'd been focused on securing the ground level. Creatures had tried to enter through the roof once before. Could I exit the same way? I climbed onto the shelving unit and pushed at the hatch. It resisted, sealed by years of paint and disuse, but finally yielded with a scrape of metal on metal. Cool air flowed down from above, carrying the smell of rain and mildew. I pulled myself up into the narrow space between the drop ceiling and the actual roof. The darkness was absolute until my eyes adjusted, revealing a crawl space maybe 3 feet high, crisscrossed with support beams and HVAC ducts. I used my lighter to navigate, moving carefully to avoid falling through the ceiling tiles into the compromised store below. The roof access ladder was against the northern wall, a permanent metal ladder bolted to the structure, leading up to a hatch that opened to the exterior. I climbed slowly, testing each rung, listening for sounds of creatures above. The hatch was locked from inside. I worked the bolt free and pushed. Daylight flooded in. Fresh air. Open sky. I emerged onto the flat roof of the quick stop and saw the world for the first time in 4 months. The devastation was total. Millbrook was visible in the distance, or what remained of it. Smoke rose from multiple locations, thick columns that stained the orange sky darker. The highway stretched in both directions, clogged with abandoned vehicles as far as I could see. The woods on the far side of the road showed signs of fire damage. Entire sections burned to ash. And everywhere, creatures wandered aimlessly through the ruins. Hundreds of them. Thousands, maybe. From my elevated position, I could see them scattered across the landscape like ants. Individual figures reduced to small moving dots, but collectively forming an overwhelming horde that covered every visible surface. There was no escape, no rescue coming, no safe haven visible in any direction. The world had ended, and I'd survived it alone in a convenience store for 4 months. But survival had just been a longer route to the same destination everyone else had reached. I sat on the roof edge, legs dangling over the side, and watched the sun track across the wrong-colored sky. Below me, creatures pressed against the building, unaware that their prey had moved above them. I could see the parking lot from here. My truck, the scattered merchandise from my destroyed backpack, the bodies of the creatures I'd killed. Grocery's corpse had been trampled by the others, reduced to a smear. Kid stood near the propane cage, still reaching toward nothing, patient and eternal. I could jump. The fall wouldn't kill me immediately. The roof was only 12 feet up, but it would injure me badly enough that the creatures could finish the job quickly. It would be faster than starving in the back room, cleaner than shooting myself. One moment of courage, then nothing. My legs swung over empty air. The creatures groaned below, calling me down to them. But I didn't jump. Instead, I noticed something I'd missed from ground level. The cell tower. It stood maybe half a mile to the west, rising above the tree line, and at its base I could see structures that hadn't been there before. Vehicles arranged in a defensive circle. Smoke from what looked like controlled fires, not the wild burning visible in Millbrook. Movement that seemed purposeful rather than the aimless wandering of the infected. People. Living people. I watched for an hour, confirming the pattern. Figures moved between the vehicles, carrying objects working together, exhibiting coordination that the creatures lacked. It could have been a settlement, could have been survivors, could have been hope. Half a mile across infected territory, with limited ammunition and exhausted body. The odds were worse than my original escape attempt, but unlike the truck plan, this had an actual destination, a potential reason to survive beyond just postponing death. I climbed back down into the crawl space and returned to the back room. For the next 3 days, I prepared for my final attempt. I ate everything I could spare, building my strength back up despite knowing it would exhaust my supplies. I cleaned and rechecked my weapons. I studied the terrain from the roof, memorizing the route, straight west through the woods using the trees as cover, avoiding the highway where creatures congregated around abandoned vehicles. I wrote a new final note in my notebook. Day 134. Saw survivors at the cell tower. Going to try to reach them. If I don't make it, at least I tried. If I do make it, I'll come back for this notebook someday. Staying human is about making choices. I'm choosing to believe there's still something worth reaching for. Derek Holloway, signing off. On day 135, at dawn, I climbed back onto the roof. The creatures below hadn't dispersed. They never dispersed, but they'd clustered more heavily around the front of the building, drawn by the noise I'd made during my escape attempt. The backside had fewer, maybe 8 or 9, visible from above. I positioned myself above the propane tank cage, which would give me something to climb down rather than jumping and risking injury. The shotgun hung across my back on a makeshift sling I'd created from rope in the supply closet. The knife was secured on my belt. I had no supplies except what I could carry in my pockets: lighter, can opener, small first aid kit. I was as ready as I'd ever be. I lowered myself over the edge, feet finding the cage top, then jumping the final 6 feet to the ground. The creatures reacted immediately, but I was already running toward the woods, legs burning, lungs screaming, everything hurting, but not as much as staying in the store would have hurt. 20 feet, 50 feet, 100 feet. I crashed into the tree line and kept moving, dodging between trunks, jumping fallen branches, refusing to look back because looking back meant seeing how many were chasing me and knowing that would make me give up. 200 feet. 300 feet. The groaning faded slightly, filtered through the trees. I risked a glance backward and saw maybe 15 creatures following, but they were slower in the woods, confused by obstacles, losing ground. I could make it. I could actually make it. The cell tower grew larger ahead of me, the defensive circle of vehicles visible through the thinning trees. I could see people now, actual living people moving around fires, and one of them was pointing in my direction, shouting something to the others. 400 feet, 500 feet, a creature lunged from behind a tree directly in my path. I didn't have time to shoot. I just lowered my shoulder and crashed into it, using momentum to knock it aside, hearing it fall with a wet thud as I stumbled but kept my feet. 600 feet. The people at the cell tower were waving at me now, gesturing urgently, and I realized they were pointing behind me. I heard a sound that wasn't groaning, a deep rumble, mechanical and powerful, and I turned my head while running to see a pickup truck racing through the woods, crushing undergrowth, heading directly toward me. Living people in the truck. They'd seen me. They were coming. The truck screeched to a stop beside me and hands reached out, grabbing my arms, hauling me into the bed before I fully processed what was happening. The driver gunned the engine, and we lurched forward as creatures stumbled after us, reaching with futile hands toward prey that was finally escaping. I lay in the truck bed, gasping, staring up at the wrong-colored sky, feeling hands checking me for bites, hearing voices asking if I was okay, if I was hurt, where I'd come from. The store, I managed to say. The quick stop. I survived in the quick stop. For how long? A voice asked. Male, young, concerned. 135 days. Silence greeted that answer. Then someone whistled low. That's a record, man. Nobody else has made it past 90 solo. The truck reached the defensive circle and they helped me out, leading me toward a fire where more people gathered. Maybe 40 survivors total, living in a makeshift camp around the cell tower's base. They looked tired and dirty and scared, but they were alive. They were human. They were still fighting. Someone handed me water. Someone else brought food that wasn't from a can. A woman with medical training checked me over, confirming I wasn't infected, just malnourished and exhausted and traumatized. You're safe now, she said gently. We've got defenses. We've got supplies. We've got each other. You made it. I looked back toward the woods, toward the quick stop hidden somewhere in that direction, and thought about my notebook still sitting in the back room, documenting every day of isolation, every can of soup, every moment of slowly deteriorating sanity. I'd survived, not because I was special or strong or clever, but because I'd been stubborn enough to keep rationing, to keep checking barricades, to keep believing that staying human mattered even when humanity seemed extinct. The fluorescent lights were finally silent. The groaning was finally distant. I was finally, impossibly, free.